The morning light crept through the thin curtains like an unwelcome visitor casting pale shadows across the worn linoleum floor. Colton Mercer sat at the kitchen table, his calloused hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. He had not moved since dawn. He had not needed to. The numbers in his head never changed no matter how many times he counted them. $50. That was what remained of everything he had built, everything he had worked for, everything he had promised his wife before the cancer took her 18 months ago. $50 sitting in a cracked leather wallet beside his breakfast plate. Two 20s and a 10. The sum total of a life that had somehow slipped through his fingers like water through a broken dam. Beside the wallet sat a small velvet box, its navy fabric faded from years of handling. Inside that box lay a simple gold band with a modest diamond that caught the morning light and threw tiny rainbows across the kitchen wall. Grace's wedding ring. The ring he had placed on her finger 23 years ago in a small church outside of Billings while her father cried in the front pew and her mother pretended not to. Colton had carried that ring with him every day since the funeral. He kept it in his pocket during work, set it on his nightstand, while he slept on the second-hand sofa that served as his bed, and sometimes held it in his palm during the quiet hours when the grief felt too heavy to bear alone. The ring was his last connection to the woman who had made him believe he could be more than what his circumstances suggested. The woman who had given him a son and a reason to keep fighting. The ring was also worth maybe $300 at a pawn shop. He had checked 3 times. Each time he had walked away. But he knew the day was coming when walking away would no longer be an option. Across the table, 9-year-old Wyatt Mercer sat eating his cereal with the methodical patience of a child who had learned not to ask for seconds. His dark hair stuck up at odd angles from sleep, and his eyes carried a seriousness that no child should possess. In front of him lay a notebook he had found at a garage sale last summer. Its pages filled with drawings he created during the quiet hours when his father thought he was sleeping. Colton watched his son sketch without looking up from his work. The boy's pencil moved with purpose across the page, adding windows to a house that existed only in his imagination. A house with a big yard. A house with trees tall enough to climb. A house with a room where a person could spread out without bumping into walls. Wyatt drew what he dreamed of because dreaming was free. The apartment they rented was not much larger than a storage unit. The living room held a sofa that doubled as Colton's bed, a coffee table made from milk crates and a piece of plywood, and a television that worked only if you held the antenna at precisely the right angle. Wyatt's bedroom was barely large enough for a twin mattress and a small dresser, but the boy had made it his own with drawings taped to the walls and a collection of interesting rocks arranged on the windowsill. They had moved here 8 months ago, when the medical bills finally consumed the last of their savings. Before that, they had rented a small house on the east side of town. Before that, they had owned a modest 3-bedroom home that Grace had decorated with photographs and homemade curtains, and the kind of love that turned simple walls into something sacred. The bank had taken that house 4 months after the funeral. Colton had watched strangers carry out furniture that still smelled like his wife's perfume. He had held Wyatt's hand while the boy said goodbye to the bedroom where his mother used to read him stories. He had locked the front door for the final time and walked away from everything they had built together. That was when Colton learned that grief was not the hardest part. The hardest part was watching your child lose faith in the future, one small disappointment at a time. Dad. Wyatt spoke without looking up from his drawing, his pencil still moving across the page. Mrs. Patterson says some kids at school are going camping this weekend. Real camping with tents and everything. Colton set down his coffee cup carefully, recognizing the particular way his son introduced topics they could not afford. Wyatt had learned not to ask directly for things. He presented information like a news report, neutral and factual, leaving space for his father to respond without feeling pressured. It was a survival skill no 9-year-old should need to develop. That sounds like fun, buddy. What kind of camping? The kind where you sleep outside and cook over a fire and do not have to hear Mr. Reynolds upstairs practicing his trumpet at midnight. Wyatt's pencil continued moving, adding a tree to his drawing. A tree with a tire swing hanging from its lowest branch. I told her we probably could not go, because we do not have camping stuff. The weight of those words settled into Colton's chest, like a stone dropped into still water. His son had stopped asking for things months ago, but he had not stopped wanting them. The camping trip, the baseball glove he had admired through the window of the sporting goods store, the bicycle with working brakes that would let him ride safely with the other kids in the neighborhood. Wyatt had transformed his wishes into quiet observations, protecting his father from the pain of having to say no. Colton worked as a mechanic at Brennan's Auto Repair, a job that barely covered their basic expenses, but allowed him the flexibility to pick Wyatt up from school each afternoon. Mike Brennan was a decent man who understood that single fathers sometimes needed to leave early for parent-teacher conferences or stay home with sick children. The pay was modest, but the understanding was worth more than money on the days when everything else felt impossible. Their routine had developed its own rhythm over the past year. Colton would wake before dawn, shower in their cramped bathroom, and make coffee, while Wyatt got himself ready for school. The boy would pack his own lunch from whatever was available in the refrigerator, load his backpack without being reminded, and wait by the door for his father to drive him across town. At pickup time, Wyatt would be standing at the school entrance with a smile that seemed designed to reassure his father that everything was fine. He would share stories about his day during the drive home, carefully avoiding any mention of field trips that cost money, school supplies that needed replacing, or activities that required registration fees. In the evenings, they would sit together at this same kitchen table. Wyatt's homework spread out next to Colton's bills and budget calculations. Sometimes Wyatt would ask about his mother, and Colton would share stories about Grace's laugh, her terrible cooking, her way of making every ordinary moment feel like something worth remembering. They would look through photo albums when the sadness felt manageable. They would remember birthday parties and Christmas mornings when money had not been quite so tight, and the future had seemed full of possibilities rather than obstacles. But the photo albums came out less often now. The stories about Grace had grown shorter. The silences between father and son had grown longer, filled with things neither of them knew how to say. Colton understood that he was failing his son in ways that went beyond money. He was failing to give Wyatt hope. He was failing to show him that hard work and good intentions could still lead somewhere worth going. He was failing to be the father Grace had believed he could be when she chose him over every other possibility her life had offered. The idea of owning property had seemed like an impossible dream until 3 days ago when Colton overheard two men talking at the auto shop. They were discussing a county tax auction where properties with unpaid taxes would be sold to the highest bidder. Sometimes one man said you could pick up land for almost nothing if nobody else wanted the hassle. Almost nothing. Colton had driven past the courthouse that afternoon watching people climb the steps with auction sheets in their hands and determination in their eyes. He had wondered what it would feel like to own something, to have a place where no landlord could raise the rent or force them to move, to give Wyatt roots instead of the constant uncertainty of wondering where they would end up next. On impulse, he had walked inside and requested the auction list from the county clerk's office. Most of the properties were far beyond anything he could afford. Houses worth tens of thousands of dollars with back taxes in the thousands. Commercial buildings. Vacant lots in developing neighborhoods. But near the bottom of the list, he found something unexpected. A cabin on 2.3 acres of wooded land. Back taxes of $50. Minimum bid of $50. The property description was brief and discouraging. Structure in severe disrepair. No utilities connected. Access road in poor condition. Previous owner deceased estate unclaimed for decades. Colton had read those words 5 times, certain he was missing something. Properties did not sell for $50. There had to be a catch, a lien, an environmental hazard, something that explained why anyone would let land go for the price of a restaurant dinner. But the clerk had confirmed the details. The cabin had been abandoned since the late 1980s. The county wanted it off their books. Nobody had shown serious interest in years. 2.3 acres. A structure, however, damaged. A chance to own something instead of renting someone else's future. Colton had taken the auction sheet home and studied it until the words blurred together. He had calculated distances and estimated repair costs, and imagined what it might feel like to tell his son they had a place that belonged to them. That night, Wyatt had found him sitting at this same kitchen table with the auction listing spread out before him. "What is that, Dad? Just something I am thinking about, buddy. Remember how you are always drawing houses with big yards?" Wyatt had nodded, moving closer to look over his father's shoulder at the grainy photograph of an overgrown cabin surrounded by trees. "Well, there is this place out past the edge of town. It is just a cabin, really. Probably needs a lot of work, but it has got 2 whole acres of woods, trees to climb, space to run around. Maybe even room to build a treehouse someday." The hope that flickered in Wyatt's eyes had been almost painful to witness. A light switching on in a room that had been dark for too long. Could we really buy it, maybe? It is not much to look at right now. But sometimes the most broken places hold the biggest possibilities. Wyatt had spent the next 3 days filling his notebook with drawings of their cabin. He imagined how they might repair the roof, where they might plant a garden, how they might clear a space for a workshop where his father could fix things, and he could build projects of his own. His drawings showed a place transformed by patience and effort, a place where a father and son could create something meaningful together. Now, sitting at the breakfast table on the morning of the auction, Colton felt the weight of those drawings pressing against his chest. His son believed in possibilities again. His son was allowing himself to hope. The auction started in 2 hours. Colton had $50. Wyatt pushed his cereal bowl aside and reached into his notebook. pulling out a folded piece of paper. He slid it across the table without saying anything, watching his father's face as he unfolded it. The drawing showed two figures standing in front of a cabin. One tall, one small, both smiling. Behind them, the cabin stood straight and proud, its walls free of vines, its windows gleaming in what appeared to be afternoon sunlight. A tire swing hung from a massive oak tree in the front yard. Smoke curled from a stone chimney. In the corner, in Wyatt's careful handwriting, were two words: "Our home. For luck, Dad." Wyatt's voice was quiet but steady. "I know it might not work out, but I wanted you to have something to hold on to, just in case." Colton stared at the drawing until his vision blurred. His son was giving him permission to try and permission to fail. His son was saying that the attempt mattered more than the outcome. He folded the drawing carefully and slipped it into his shirt pocket next to his heart. "I have to go to the courthouse, buddy. The auction starts at 10. "I know." Wyatt returned to his cereal, his voice deliberately casual. "I will be fine at school. You can tell me everything when you pick me up." Colton stood and moved around the table, placing his hand on his son's shoulder. Wyatt leaned into the touch without looking up, accepting the comfort his father offered. "Whatever happens today, I want you to know something. I'm going to keep trying. For you. For us. For what your mother believed we could build together." "I know, Dad." Wyatt's voice carried a certainty that seemed too heavy for a 9-year-old. "That is why I made the drawing." The drive to the courthouse took 20 minutes through morning traffic. Colton parked his aging Honda in a spot near the back of the lot and sat for a moment with his hands on the steering wheel. The engine ticked as it cooled. A bird called from somewhere in the trees that lined the parking area. The world continued its ordinary business while Colton prepared to gamble everything on a chance that most people would consider foolish. He reached into his pocket and pulled out Wyatt's drawing, studying it one more time. The cabin his son had imagined looked nothing like the photograph in the auction listing. It looked like hope given physical form. It looked like the kind of place where a family could heal. Colton had not thought of himself and Wyatt as a family in months. They were survivors. They were two people sharing cramped quarters while they figured out what came next. But Wyatt's drawing showed something different. It showed a father and son who belonged somewhere, who had built something worth keeping. He folded the drawing and returned it to his pocket. Then he picked up the velvet box containing Grace's ring and held it in his palm. "I am going to try," he whispered to no one and everyone at once. "I'm going to try because giving up is not something you ever taught me how to do." The courthouse steps buzzed with quiet energy as Colton climbed toward the entrance. Around him, other potential bidders moved with purpose, some carrying clipboards and calculators, others clutching auction sheets with notes scrawled in the margins. He recognized the difference between the professionals and the dreamers. The professionals wore clean boots and confident expressions. The dreamers wore hope like armor against the possibility of disappointment. Colton fell somewhere between the two categories. He was practical enough to understand the risks and desperate enough to take them anyway. Inside the courthouse, a large meeting room had been converted into an auction space. Folding chairs faced a makeshift platform where a weathered man named Carl Hendricks was adjusting a portable microphone. Carl had been conducting these sales for 15 years according to the clerk who handed Colton his bidder number. He knew that behind every raised hand was someone's dream or someone's last resort. Colton took a seat near the back of the room, his bidder number 63, clutched in hands that would not stop trembling. Around him, approximately 30 other people settled into chairs and prepared for the day's business. Investors compared notes. Contractors discussed potential projects. Families like his own tried to contain their nervous energy. Ladies and gentlemen, Carl's voice crackled through the speaker system. We will be starting with the commercial properties and working our way down to the residential and rural listings. Please have your bidder numbers ready and remember that all sales are final. Cash or certified check only. Colton's property was number 47 on a list of 52. He watched as houses, empty lots, and small commercial buildings went to investors with deep pockets and quick decisions. A gas station with environmental issues sold for $12,000. A house with foundation problems went for $8,000. Each successful bid represented someone's new beginning, but also reminded Colton how outmatched he was in this world of real estate speculation. The morning wore on. His palms grew damp despite the air conditioning. The $50 in his wallet felt increasingly inadequate as he listened to bids climb into figures he could not imagine possessing. Property number 40, residential lot on Maple Street. Back taxes, $850. Minimum bid, $850. Colton's heart began to race as the numbers climbed closer to his listing. Property number 41, property number 42, property number 43. Each announcement brought him closer to the moment that would either change their lives or confirm that some dreams were simply too expensive for people who had already lost so much. Property number 47. Colton felt the room shift around him as Carl's voice cut through the background noise. Rural property. 2.3 acres including structure described as cabin. Back taxes $50. Minimum bid $50. A murmur rippled through the remaining crowd. $50 was unusually low even for a property in poor condition. Several bidders flipped through their sheets trying to locate the listing they might have overlooked in their initial review. This property is located on Pine Ridge Road. Carl continued approximately 12 miles east of town. Access is via unpaved road in poor condition. Structure is reported in severe disrepair, with no utilities connected. Buyer will be responsible for any environmental assessments or structural remediation. Previous owner was Henry. Carl squinted at his paperwork. Howard Callahan. Property has been abandoned since approximately 1987. Carl's description was thorough and discouraging. The kind of description designed to manage expectations and prevent complaints after the sale. Do I have an opening bid of $50? Colton's hand rose before his mind could talk him out of it. His bidder number felt like a flag of surrender and declaration of war at the same time. I have 50 from bidder 63. Carl nodded in his direction. Do I have 75? The seconds stretched like hours. Colton scanned the room expecting someone to raise their hand to outbid him with casual ease to end his dream before it had truly begun. But the other bidders were consulting their papers. Many were shaking their heads. A cabin in severe disrepair with no utilities and difficult access was not attractive to most investors. Too much work for too little return. $50 from bidder 63. Going once, going twice. Carl's gavel hovered in the air. 75. The voice came from the back of the room. Colton turned to see a man in an expensive coat and polished shoes rising from his seat. He looked like someone who bought properties the way other people bought groceries. Routine, efficient, without emotional attachment. Carl nodded at the new bidder. I have 75 from bidder 41. Do I have 100? Colton's stomach dropped through the floor. He had exactly $50. He could not go higher. His dream was about to end $25 short of success. He looked down at the drawing in his pocket, thinking about Wyatt waiting at school, thinking about the cabin his son had imagined standing straight and proud in afternoon sunlight. Then his hand moved to the velvet box, Grace's ring, the last piece of their marriage, the last tangible connection to the woman who had believed in him when no one else did. The ring was worth maybe $300, enough to bid higher, enough to win the property, enough to secure a future for their son. But selling the ring meant letting go of everything it represented. It meant acknowledging that Grace was truly gone and that their old life was never coming back. 100, Colton heard himself say, his voice steadier than his hands. Carl's eyebrows rose slightly, but professionally. I have 100 from bidder 63. Do I have 125? The man in the expensive coat studied his auction sheet with renewed interest. He was calculating something, weighing potential returns against required investment. The silence stretched for 30 seconds, then a full minute. 100 from bidder 63. Going once, going twice. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed off the courthouse walls. Sold to bidder 63 for $100. The applause was polite and brief, the kind given to any successful transaction. But to Colton, it sounded like the first notes of a symphony he had given up believing he would ever hear. He had won. The cabin was his. Now he just had to find a way to pay for it. The next hour passed in a blur of paperwork and quiet panic. Colton sat across from a clerk who explained his rights and responsibilities as the new owner while he tried to figure out how to produce $50 he did not have. Cash or certified check? The clerk repeated. Payment is due before we can transfer the deed. Colton nodded, his throat too tight for words. He reached into his pocket and placed the velvet box on the counter between them. I have 50 in cash, and I have this. It was my wife's wedding ring. It is worth at least $300. I'm hoping you can hold it as collateral while I arrange the additional funds. The clerk looked at the ring, then at Colton's face. She was a woman in her 50s with reading glasses perched on her nose and photographs of grandchildren arranged on her desk. The kind of woman who had seen enough of life to recognize desperation when it sat across from her. We do not typically accept collateral, sir. Cash or certified check. Please. Colton's voice cracked on the word. I have a son. He is 9 years old. His mother died 18 months ago. We have been moving from apartment to apartment, never having enough, never having any stability. This cabin is our chance, our only chance. The clerk studied him for a long moment. Then she picked up the velvet box and opened it, examining the ring inside. This was your wife's, yes, ma'am. I gave it to her on our wedding day. I have carried it with me since she passed. The clerk closed the box and set it aside. Then she typed something into her computer and printed a form that looked different from the others. I'm going to do something I should not do. I'm going to mark this payment as pending due to processing delay. You have until the end of business tomorrow to bring me the additional $50. If you do not return by 5 p.m., the sale will be voided and the ring will be returned to you. She pushed the form across the counter along with a pen. Do not make me regret this kindness, Mr. Mercer. Colton signed his name with a hand that would not stop shaking. Then he slid the velvet box across the counter, watching Grace's ring disappear into a drawer. I will not, he whispered. I promise you I will not. The clerk handed him a temporary deed and a set of keys that looked like they had been cut sometime in the 1970s. Old tarnished brass, with the kind of weight that suggested they had opened many doors over many years. Congratulations, she said simply. You are now the owner of 2.3 acres, and whatever structures are on that property. Previous owner was a gentleman named Howard Callahan who lived there until the late 1980s. Property has been abandoned since then. Nobody knows what happened to him. Colton stared at the keys in his hand. One appeared to be for the cabin itself, while the other was smaller with a purpose he could not guess. Thank you, he said, for everything. The clerk nodded once and returned to her paperwork. Transaction complete. Kindness extended. The story of how Colton Mercer came to own a cabin for $50 and his wife's wedding ring would not appear in any official record, but it would change everything that came after. The drive to pick up Wyatt from school passed in a state somewhere between shock and wonder. Colton kept reaching into his pocket to touch the keys, confirming they were real, confirming that somehow he had done the impossible. He had bought land. He had bought a home. He had given his son something that could not be taken away by landlords or circumstances, or the grinding machinery of a world that seemed designed to crush people who started with nothing. When he pulled into the school parking lot, Wyatt was waiting by the entrance with his backpack slung over one shoulder, and that careful smile that had learned not to expect too much. The boy climbed into the passenger seat and immediately noticed something different about his father's expression. Dad, you look different. What happened? Colton reached into his pocket and pulled out the brass keys. He held them up so they caught the afternoon light, watching his son's eyes widen as understanding dawned. We got it, buddy. We got our cabin. The joy that spread across Wyatt's face was worth every dollar, every doubt, every moment of terror Colton had experienced in the courthouse. For the first time in 18 months, his son looked like a child who believed in possibilities again. Can we see it? Can we see? Can we go there right now? Colton looked at the clock on the dashboard. 3:30. They had maybe 3 hours of daylight left, enough time to drive out to their property and get their first real look at what they had purchased. Let us go home, he said. And for the first time since Grace died, the word home referred to something that actually belonged to them. Pine Ridge Road started as cracked asphalt at the main highway before transitioning to gravel after the first mile. By the time they reached the final stretch, it had devolved into 2 tire tracks, separated by a ridge of weeds and saplings that scraped against the Honda's undercarriage as they bounced over roots and stones. "This is like a real adventure," Wyatt said, gripping his door handle as they navigated around a fallen branch. His excitement transformed potential concerns about accessibility into the thrill of exploration. After 20 minutes of careful driving, the trees opened into a small clearing, and there it was, their cabin. Colton stopped the truck, and both of them sat in silence, taking in their first real look at what $50 and a wedding ring had purchased. The structure stood like a forgotten memory in the center of the clearing, partially hidden by nearly 40 years of aggressive vine growth. What had once been a modest log cabin now appeared to be wearing a green sweater of ivy Virginia creeper and wild grapevines that had claimed every available surface. The front porch sagged at one corner where a support post had rotted through. Several roof shingles had surrendered to time and weather, leaving dark patches that promised leaks. But it was theirs. Wyatt was the first to speak. "It is bigger than I thought it would be." Colton studied the structure with his mechanic's eye for problems and potential. The log walls appeared solid despite the vegetation. The stone chimney stood straight and intact. The cabin was perhaps 24 feet wide and 30 feet deep, with what looked like a small addition on the back that might have been a bedroom or storage room. "What do you think Buddy's still excited about our new home?" Wyatt opened his door and stepped out, his sneakers crunching on fallen leaves and twigs. He walked toward the cabin with the fearless curiosity of childhood, studying it, the way he might study a wounded animal that needed help. "It is perfect, Dad." He turned back toward his father with a smile that seemed to light the entire clearing. "It just needs to be loved again." They approached the front porch, cautiously testing the floorboards before putting their full weight down. The wood was weathered gray but felt solid beneath their feet. Colton fitted the larger brass key into the front door lock, surprised when it turned easily, despite 40 years of disuse. The door swung open with a groan of hinges that had not moved since the 1980s, revealing the interior of their cabin. Afternoon sunlight slanted through gaps in the vegetation, covering the windows, creating a green-filtered twilight that made everything seem underwater. The main room was larger than their apartment's living room, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall and built-in shelves flanking it on both sides. The wooden floors were warped in places where rain had leaked through the roof, but they appeared to be solid hardwood beneath the dust and debris. "Look, Dad." Wyatt pointed toward the back of the main room where a narrow staircase led upward. "There are stairs. There is an upstairs." The loft area above was too dark to see clearly, but Colton could imagine it becoming Wyatt's bedroom, a space with slanted ceilings and windows looking out at the forest canopy, a room that belonged to his son alone. To the right of the stairs, a doorway led to the addition they had seen from outside. Wyatt was already exploring, his footsteps echoing through the empty space. "There is another room back here," he called out, "and it has its own window that looks at the trees." Colton moved through the space, slowly, mentally cataloging the work ahead. Clear the vines, repair the roof, check the foundation, install electricity and plumbing. The list seemed endless, but standing in the filtered light of their own cabin, breathing air that smelled of old wood and growing things, the work felt like opportunity rather than burden. "Dad, come here." Wyatt's voice came from near the fireplace. He was kneeling beside the built-in shelves, running his hands along the wood grain with an expression of intense concentration. "Some of these boards are loose, like they were made to come out." Colton joined his son and examined the shelving. Sure enough, several boards could be lifted free, revealing gaps where small items might have been stored decades ago. As Wyatt worked one of the longer boards loose, something crackled beneath it. "There is paper stuck under here," the boy said carefully, freeing the board and reaching into the space below. What emerged were several sheets of aged paper, yellowed at the edges and covered with handwriting in faded blue ink. The pages appeared to be journal entries dated from the mid-1980s, written in a careful, educated hand. Colton held the pages up to catch the filtered light coming through the windows. He read the first entry aloud while Wyatt listened with wide eyes. March 15th, 1987. The work is nearly complete. 23 years of research, and I believe I have finally solved the fundamental problems that have plagued the field since Tesla's early experiments. The applications are extraordinary, but I fear the implications if this knowledge falls into the wrong hands. I have decided to document everything and secure it properly. If something happens to me, perhaps someday the right person will find it and understand what needs to be done. Colton turned to the next page, his voice growing quieter as he read. The government men came by again today. They are persistent, these people who want to classify my work, to lock it away in some vault where it will benefit no one. They offer contracts and veiled threats in equal measure. I have told them nothing, but I know they will not give up easily. I am not a young man anymore, and I cannot run forever. The handwriting belonged to someone educated and thoughtful, but there was an urgency in the later entries that suggested growing pressure. Someone had been hiding something here. Someone had been afraid. "Who do you think wrote this?" Wyatt asked softly. Colton remembered what the county clerk had told him about the previous owner. Someone named Howard. Howard Callahan. He used to live here. He built this place in 1971. What happened to him, I do not know, buddy. Nobody seems to know. They spent another hour exploring the cabin with growing wonder, finding more hidden compartments and more evidence of careful preparation. In the back bedroom, Wyatt discovered that one of the built-in drawers had a false bottom, beneath which lay additional pages covered in technical diagrams and mathematical notations, far beyond anything Colton could understand. The loft area proved to be a single room with slanted ceilings and windows at both ends. Dusty, but dry. The kind of space that could become exactly what a 9-year-old boy needed. As the afternoon sun began to slant lower through the trees, they sat on the front porch steps, sharing a package of crackers Colton had brought from the car. The clearing around their cabin was larger than it had first appeared, with mature oak and maple trees providing a natural border. Through the gaps in the foliage, they could glimpse what might be a stream or creek. "So, what do you think, Wyatt? Is this the kind of place you imagined when you made those drawings?" Wyatt leaned against his father's shoulder in a gesture of contentment that had become rare since Grace's death. "It is better, Dad. In my drawings, it was just me and you in a house. But this place feels like it has stories. Like it was waiting for us to come find it." Colton looked at the weathered journal pages in his hands, thinking about the man who had written these words, who had lived in this cabin, and worked on something he believed could change the world. Howard Callahan had been alone here at the end, but he had left pieces of himself behind. Fragments of a mystery that somehow made the cabin feel less abandoned and more like a home waiting to be reclaimed. As they walked back to the car in the gathering dusk, Wyatt was already making plans for their first weekend of work. They would need tools and cleaning supplies and tarps to cover the areas where the roof was compromised. The work would be hard, but they would do it together. For the first time since Grace died, Colton felt like they were moving towards something instead of just trying to survive each passing day. The cabin was broken, but it was theirs to repair. The work ahead was daunting, but it was work with purpose. The weathered journal pages sat on the dashboard between them, a reminder that their property held more than just shelter. It held secrets and stories and perhaps the promise that even the most broken places could be made whole by the right hands and the right hearts. Colton pulled onto Pine Ridge Road and began the slow drive back toward town. Through the rearview mirror, he watched their cabin disappear into the trees. Then, something else caught his attention. A black SUV parked just off the main road, positioned where its driver would have a clear view of anyone entering or leaving the path to the cabin. The windows were tinted too dark to see inside. As Colton watched the SUV's engine started, its headlights flicked on. But instead of following them toward town, it turned and drove slowly in the opposite direction, disappearing around a curve in the road. Wyatt had noticed the vehicle too. Dad. Who was that? Colton did not answer immediately. His hands tightened on the steering wheel as a new kind of uncertainty settled into his chest. The journal entries had mentioned government men who would not give up easily. People who wanted to control something Howard Callahan had refused to surrender. The cabin had been abandoned for nearly 40 years. But maybe it had not been forgotten. I do not know, Buddy Colton finally said. But I think we need to be careful about what we found today. Let us keep those papers between us for now. Our secret. Wyatt nodded with the seriousness of a child who understood that some secrets were worth keeping. Because they protect people we love. Colton reached over and squeezed his son's shoulder. Exactly. Because they protect people we love. They drove the rest of the way in comfortable silence, father and son bound together by something more than blood and circumstance. They were bound now by a mystery that had waited nearly 4 decades for someone to find it. By a cabin that had called them home. By the strange certainty that their $50 gamble had purchased something far more valuable than 2.3 acres of overgrown forest. Tomorrow, Colton would return to the courthouse with $50 borrowed against his next paycheck. He would reclaim Grace's ring from the clerk, who had shown him unexpected kindness. He would make the purchase official. But tonight, driving through the Montana darkness with his son beside him, and hope growing where despair had lived for so long, he allowed himself to believe that maybe Grace had been right all along. Maybe he was exactly the kind of man who could build something worth keeping. Maybe the hardest part was already behind them. The following Saturday arrived with the kind of crisp October morning that made Montana feel like the most beautiful place on earth. Colton woke before dawn to find Wyatt already dressed and waiting by the door, his backpack stuffed with notebooks and the brass compass they had discovered during their first visit. The boy had not stopped talking about the cabin all week. He had filled 3 pages of his notebook with plans for their restoration work, organizing tasks by priority, and sketching diagrams of how different repairs might be accomplished. His enthusiasm was infectious. transforming what could have been an overwhelming project into an adventure they would share. Colton had returned to the courthouse on Monday with $50 borrowed against his next paycheck. The clerk had smiled when she handed over Grace's ring along with the official deed and a folder of property documents that made everything real. "You came back," she had said simply. "I made a promise." She had nodded and wished him luck with something that sounded almost like hope. Now driving toward Pine Ridge Road with the morning sun painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Colton felt something he had not experienced in 18 months. He felt like a father who had something to offer his son beyond survival. He felt like a man with a purpose. The Honda bounced along the deteriorating road, its suspension protesting every rut and root. Wyatt gripped his door handle and grinned at each jarring impact, treating the difficult access as proof that their cabin was special enough to require effort. When they emerged into the clearing, the cabin looked different in the morning light, less abandoned, more patient, like an old friend who had been waiting for them to return. "Okay, buddy." Colton killed the engine and surveyed their domain. "We start with the front. Clear the vines so we can see what we are working with. Then we check the roof and figure out what needs fixing first." Wyatt was already out of the car pulling work gloves from his backpack with the eagerness of someone who had been waiting all week for this moment. "I made a system," he announced, spreading his notebook on the hood of the Honda. "We do the front first because that is what people see. Then the sides. Then the back because nobody really looks at the back anyway." Colton studied his son's detailed drawings and felt a swell of pride. The boy had inherited his mother's organizational mind along with her artistic eye. Grace would have loved seeing him like this, engaged and planning and believing in something bigger than himself. That is smart thinking. What about the inside phase 2? First, we make the outside look like a real house. Then, we make the inside somewhere we can actually live. They attacked the vine removal with complementary energy. Colton worked on the heavier growth covering the porch roof, while Wyatt carefully untangled Virginia creeper from around the front windows. The work was slow but satisfying. Each section of cleared wall revealed more of the cabin's original character, like uncovering a painting that had been hidden beneath layers of dust. By mid-morning, they had exposed the front door completely and discovered something that made both of them stop and stare. A small wooden plaque mounted beside the entrance, weathered but still legible. The carved letters spelled out a name and a year. Callahan, 1971. "He built this place himself," Colton said, running his fingers over the carved letters. "Howard Callahan was 25 years old when he started. Just a young man with a piece of land and a dream. Like us," Wyatt said quietly. "Except we are fixing it instead of building it." Colton looked at his son and saw understanding in his eyes. The boy grasped something essential about their project. They were not just repairing a structure. They were continuing a story that had been interrupted nearly 4 decades ago. As they worked through the morning, they began to understand more about the man who had lived here. The cabin had been constructed with unusual attention to detail. Joints fitted precisely, logs carefully selected and matched, windows positioned to capture maximum light while maintaining privacy from the access road. This was not the work of a weekend hobbyist. This was the careful creation of someone who understood both craftsmanship and engineering. someone who had built this place to last. By noon, they had cleared the entire front wall, revealing windows that appeared intact, despite decades of neglect. The glass was dirty and covered with cobwebs, but unbroken. The frames showed no signs of rot. Wyatt pressed his face against one of the newly visible windows and peered inside. "It looks bigger from out here," he observed. "Like the cabin is happy we are cleaning it." Colton smiled at his son's imagination, but he understood the sentiment. The structure did seem to be responding to their attention, emerging from its cocoon of vegetation like something preparing to live again. They ate lunch on the front porch steps, sharing sandwiches Colton had packed that morning. The October sun warmed their faces while birds called from the surrounding trees. For a few perfect minutes, the world felt exactly right. "Dad, can I explore the inside while you work on the porch?" Colton considered the request. The cabin's interior had seemed stable during their first visit, but he had not examined the floors carefully. "Stay on the main level. Do not go up to the loft until I can check those stairs properly, and call me if anything feels wrong." Wyatt nodded and disappeared through the front door, his footsteps echoing through the empty space. Colton returned to his work on the sagging porch support, trying to determine whether the post could be reinforced or needed complete replacement. He was examining the base of the damaged post when Wyatt's voice reached him from inside. "Dad, come here. I found something." The tone was not alarmed, but there was an intensity to it that made Colton set down his tools immediately. He found his son kneeling beside the stone fireplace, running his hands along a section of stonework that looked slightly different from the rest. "This rock moves," Wyatt said, demonstrating by wiggling a stone about the size of a brick. "It is not stuck like the others. Someone made it so it could come out." Colton knelt beside his son and examined the loose stone. The mortar around it had been carefully cut away and replaced with something that merely looked like mortar. A casual observer would never notice the difference, but a curious 9-year-old with patient hands had found the hidden seam. "Can I pull it out?" "Carefully. We do not know what is behind it." Wyatt worked the stone free with the precision of a surgeon, revealing a cavity in the fireplace wall about the size of a shoebox. Inside the dark space, something gleamed in the filtered light. More papers, Wyatt breathed, reaching into the cavity. And something else. What emerged was a collection of artifacts that made their first discoveries seem preliminary. Technical drawings rendered in precise detail with notes in the same careful handwriting they had found beneath the floorboards. Mathematical equations that covered entire pages. And wrapped in oiled cloth, a small metal cylinder about the size of a flashlight, machined with tolerances that spoke of professional equipment and expensive materials. Colton held the cylinder in his hands, feeling its unexpected weight. The metalwork was beautiful, precise, the kind of craftsmanship that cost serious money and required specialized knowledge. "What is it?" Wyatt asked. "I have no idea, but whoever made this was not playing around. This is professional work." The technical drawings were even more impressive than the first batch. These diagrams showed complete systems rather than individual components, with notations suggesting that working prototypes had been built and tested. Labels included phrases like resonance frequency amplification and harmonic energy conversion. terms that meant nothing to Colton but clearly represented something significant to whoever had written them. At the bottom of the cavity, wrapped in waterproof plastic, was the most intriguing discovery of all: a hand-drawn map of their property. Not a simple boundary sketch, but a detailed topographical rendering that showed underground water sources, elevation changes, and several locations marked with cryptic symbols. The map was labeled with coordinates and measurements, the work of someone who had surveyed every inch of the 2.3 acres. Wyatt studied the symbols with intense concentration. "These look like a treasure map," he said, "like X marks the spot. Except there are a lot of spots." Colton counted 7 distinct symbols scattered across the property, each one different from the others. Some appeared to mark natural features. Others seemed to indicate man-made structures or buried objects. "I think you were right, buddy. I think Howard Callahan hid things all over this property, and he made a map so someone could find them. Someone like us, maybe. Or maybe he was just being careful, making sure his work would survive even if he did not." They spent the next hour examining their discoveries, trying to understand what they had inherited along with the cabin. The technical drawings were beyond Colton's expertise, but he recognized sophisticated engineering when he saw it. Howard Callahan had been working on something important, something complex enough to require years of research and expensive equipment. The metal cylinder remained a mystery. It was clearly a component of something larger, matching elements shown in several of the diagrams. But without understanding the full system, Colton could only guess at its purpose. "Dad," Wyatt said suddenly, his voice dropping to a whisper, "what if the people who wanted his work are still looking for it?" The question landed like a stone in still water. Colton had been avoiding that thought all week, pushing it aside whenever it surfaced. But his son had given voice to the fear that had been growing since they spotted the black SUV on their first visit. "I do not know," he admitted, "but I think we need to be careful. We should not tell anyone about what we are finding here. Not until we understand more about what it means." Wyatt nodded with the seriousness of a child who understood that some games had real consequences. "Our secret," he said, "because it protects the people we love." Colton hugged his son, drawing strength from the boy's steady presence. "Exactly right, buddy. Exactly right." That afternoon, they decided to follow the map to the nearest marked location. The symbol indicated a spot approximately 50 yards behind the cabin, near what the drawing showed as a natural spring feeding into a small creek. The forest behind their property was denser than the clearing around the cabin. Old-growth trees created a canopy that filtered the afternoon light into golden shafts. The ground was soft, with decades of fallen leaves muffling their footsteps as they made their way toward the coordinates on Howard's map. Wyatt held the brass compass, calling out directions while Colton matched their position to landmarks indicated on the drawing. The boy had a natural sense of navigation, adjusting their course with the kind of intuitive understanding that could not be taught. "We should be close," Wyatt announced. "The spring is supposed to be just past those big rocks." They pushed through a final screen of underbrush and found themselves at the edge of a small pool, fed by water, emerging from a rocky hillside. The spring ran clear and cold, forming a basin about 6 feet across, before overflowing into a creek that wound deeper into the forest. But it was not the spring that made them stop and stare. Partially hidden by ferns and fallen logs was a concrete structure about the size of a large tombstone, clearly man-made, clearly intentional. The concrete was weathered but intact, and set into its top surface was a metal plate with a symbol etched into it, the same symbol that appeared on their map. "It is like a marker," Wyatt said, kneeling beside the concrete structure. "Like Howard left signs for people to follow." Colton examined the metal plate more closely and discovered that it was not merely decorative. The plate could be rotated like a dial, clicking into different positions as he turned it. Each click aligned the etched symbol with one of several small notches cut into the concrete around its edge. "Some kind of mechanism," he muttered. "But for what, Dad, look at this." Wyatt had to have been exploring around the spring while his father examined the marker. Now he stood near the water's edge, pointing at something partially buried in the soft earth. Another metal object. This one cylindrical, about the same size as the component they had found in the fireplace. Colton used his pocket knife to carefully excavate it from the soil, brushing away decades of accumulated dirt. The cylinder was heavier than it looked, with one end that could be unscrewed to reveal complex internal components. Unlike the simple elegance of the compass, this device looked almost futuristic, despite having been buried for nearly 40 years. He was not just designing things, Colton said slowly. He was building them, and he was hiding them all over this property. Why would someone hide their own inventions? Because someone else wanted to take them. Colton looked at his son, seeing the question reflected in the boy's eyes. Remember what the journal said. Government people who wanted to control his work. Howard was protecting what he built by spreading it out, making sure no one could find everything at once. The implications settled around them like falling leaves. Their cabin was not just an abandoned building. It was the outer shell of something much larger. A hidden repository of technology and research that someone had considered valuable enough to pursue for decades. As they made their way back toward the cabin, Colton's mind raced through possibilities. The black SUV they had seen on their first visit. The journal entries describing government pressure. The careful way Howard had hidden his work in multiple locations. Something was wrong with this picture. Something did not fit. If Howard Callahan had been dead for nearly 40 years, why would anyone still be watching the property? Unless they were not sure he was dead. Unless they were still looking. The thought made Colton walk faster, his hand finding Wyatt's shoulder and pulling the boy closer. Whatever secrets their cabin held, they were clearly secrets that someone else wanted, and that someone might be closer than Colton had imagined. They reached the clearing just as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the tree line. The cabin stood where they had left it, front wall cleared and windows gleaming in the golden light. It looked almost welcoming now, almost like home. But something was different. Colton stopped at the edge of the clearing, his mechanic's instincts screaming that something had changed since they left. He scanned the area, trying to identify what felt wrong. Then he saw it. High in an oak tree near the access road, partially concealed by remaining foliage, was a camera. Not a game camera for wildlife. Not a security device from a neighboring property. This was a professional surveillance unit, weathered and dirty, with a lens pointed directly at the cabin's front door. Someone had been watching this property for a very long time. Dad. Wyatt had followed his father's gaze and spotted the camera. "What is that?" Colton did not answer immediately. He was calculating distances and angles, trying to determine how long the camera had been there and whether it was still operational. I think he said carefully that we are not the only people interested in what Howard Callahan left behind. They gathered their tools and discoveries, quickly loading everything into the Honda with an urgency that had not existed an hour ago. Colton took one last look at the camera before starting the engine. It had been watching, but for how long? And for whom? The drive back to town felt longer than usual. Wyatt sat quietly in the passenger seat, clutching the brass compass and the map they had found. The boy understood without being told that their situation had changed, that their simple renovation project had become something more complicated and potentially dangerous. "We should not come back for a while," Wyatt said as they reached the paved road, "until we figure out who put that camera there." Colton shook his head. "No, that is exactly what they would expect us to do. If we stop coming, they will know we found something important. We keep working on the cabin like nothing has changed. We just have to be more careful about what we find and where we look." "Okay." Wyatt was quiet for a moment. "Dad, are we in danger?" It was the question Colton had been dreading. The question that required an honest answer, even though honesty might be terrifying. "I do not know, buddy. But I know that whatever Howard was working on, he believed it was important enough to protect with his life. And I know that the right thing to do is not always the safe thing. So we are going to keep going. We are going to find out what he was trying to preserve. And we are going to make sure his work was not wasted. Because that is what Mom would want us to do." Colton smiled despite the fear coiling in his chest. "Yeah, that is exactly what Mom would want us to do." 3 days later, Colton was working on a transmission at Brennan's Auto when a stranger walked into the shop. The man was perhaps 50 years old, well-dressed in a way that seemed out of place among the oil stains and scattered tools. He wore a sport coat over a crisp white shirt and carried himself with the careful posture of someone accustomed to observing without being observed. Mr. Mercer Colton wiped his hands on a shop rag and turned to face the visitor. "Can I help you?" "I hope so. My name is Raymond Schultz. I am a researcher with the Montana Historical Society. I understand you recently purchased a property on Pine Ridge Road." The lie was smooth and practiced, but it was definitely a lie. Colton had spent enough years reading people across poker tables and service counters to recognize deception when he saw it. "That is right." "What about it?" "The previous owner was a man named Howard Callahan. A fascinating figure from what I've been able to learn. He did some interesting work back in the 70s and 80s. Before he disappeared." "Disappeared?" Schultz smiled without warmth. "Left the area. Abandoned the property. No one seems to know what happened to him. I was hoping you might have found some of his papers or personal effects during your renovation work. Historical documents, letters, that sort of thing. The society would be very interested in preserving anything related to his life and work." Colton maintained a neutral expression while his mind raced through implications. This man knew about Howard Callahan, knew about his work, and wanted whatever might have survived. Sorry to disappoint you, but the place was pretty much empty when we got there. Some old furniture, a lot of dirt. Nothing worth preserving as far as I could tell. Schultz studied him for a long moment, his eyes searching for cracks in the casual response. That is unfortunate. Callahan was quite brilliant in his field, a real loss to the scientific community when he vanished. What field was that? The smile returned thin and careful. Energy research. Alternative approaches to power generation. Very ahead of his time. Very controversial with certain government agencies who preferred more conventional methods. The words hung in the air between them. A warning disguised as small talk. Well, Colton said if I find anything interesting while we are fixing up the place, I will be sure to let the Historical Society know. I would appreciate that. Schultz produced a business card and placed it on the workbench, my contact information. In case you remember anything useful. Colton watched the man leave, noting the way he scanned the parking lot before climbing into a dark sedan. The same dark sedan Colton realized that he had seen parked near the cabin access road. Not a historian, not a researcher. Something else entirely. He picked up the business card and studied it. Raymond Schultz, Montana Historical Preservation Society. A phone number with a local area code. The card looked authentic, but the man had not. That evening, Colton told Wyatt about the visitor while they ate dinner at their cramped kitchen table. The boy listened with the serious attention he always gave to important information. He was lying, Wyatt said matter-of-factly. About being a historian. I think so too. Which means someone is very interested in what Howard left behind. Someone who is willing to pretend to be something they are not. The FBI may be like in the movies, maybe. Or maybe something else. The journal mentioned government people who wanted to control Howard's work. That was almost 40 years ago. If they are still looking, they must believe something important is still hidden at our cabin. Wyatt pushed his food around his plate, thinking, we should find it first, before they do. Colton looked at his son and saw determination where fear might have been expected. The boy was not backing down from the challenge. He was rising to meet it. That is exactly what I was thinking, buddy. This weekend we go back and we search properly. Every symbol on that map. Every hidden compartment we can find. We figure out what Howard was protecting and then we decide what to do about it. The weekend arrived with overcast skies and the threat of rain. Perfect weather for staying inside. Perfect weather for exploring the interior of a cabin that held more secrets than either of them had imagined. They arrived at the property early, parking the Honda behind the cabin, where it would not be visible from the access road. Colton had disabled the surveillance camera during their previous visit, carefully removing its power source without damaging the unit. If someone was monitoring the feed, they would assume a technical malfunction rather than deliberate interference. The first hours were spent searching the cabin systematically, checking every board, every stone, every piece of built-in furniture for hidden compartments. They found 3 more caches of documents and components, each one expanding their understanding of Howard Callahan's work. The technical drawings showed a progression of designs spanning nearly 2 decades. Early sketches gave way to refined schematics. Theoretical notes evolved into practical specifications. Howard had been building towards something specific, something he called the harmonic energy converter in his later notes, a device that could generate clean power indefinitely, without fuel, without waste, without the infrastructure that made conventional energy production expensive and environmentally destructive. "Dad," Wyatt called from the back bedroom, "I found another hidden drawer, but this one has something different." Colton joined his son and saw what had captured his attention. Unlike the technical drawings and journal pages, this compartment contained government documents, official letterhead, classification stamps, correspondence between Howard Callahan and agencies whose names had been partially redacted. The documents told a story that was both fascinating and troubling. Howard had indeed worked with the military earlier in his career, developing communications technology during the Cold War era, but his interests had evolved beyond what his employers wanted. He had begun pursuing research into energy systems that threatened to make existing power infrastructure obsolete. The government had offered contracts, funding, and resources. Howard had refused, citing concerns about weaponization and controlled access. The correspondence grew increasingly tense over the years, culminating in a final letter dated just weeks before Howard's last journal entry. The letter informed Howard Callahan that his independent research had been classified as vital to national security. Continued work outside of government oversight would be considered a violation of federal law. The message was clear: surrender or face consequences. Howard had chosen a third option. He disappeared. Wyatt said softly. He hid everything and ran away. Or he hid everything and stayed. Colton replied, a new possibility forming in his mind. Think about it. The camera was still working. Someone has been maintaining it. Someone who knows the property. Someone who has been watching to see who comes and goes. You think Howard is still alive? I think someone is. And I think they have been waiting for the right people to find what was hidden here. The rain started as they were exploring the small shed behind the cabin. Wyatt had noticed the structure during their first visit, but had not paid much attention to it. Now, seeking shelter from the sudden downpour, they ducked inside and found themselves in a space that did not make sense. "Dad, this is weird." Wyatt paced the interior of the shed, counting his steps. "When I walk around the outside, it is maybe 8 steps wide, but inside it is like 12 steps. How is that possible?" Colton examined the walls more carefully, looking for the discrepancy his son had identified. The boy was right. The interior dimensions did not match the exterior footprint, unless there was space hidden between the walls. They searched the shed's interior systematically, pressing against panels and testing floorboards. It was Wyatt who found the release mechanism, a wooden peg that looked like a simple nail but actually controlled a hidden latch. The back wall swung inward, revealing a passage that descended into darkness. Colton's heart hammered against his ribs as he stared into the hidden space. This was something beyond journal pages and buried cylinders. This was a secret that someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to protect. "We need flashlights," he said. "I brought 2. Wyatt was already digging through his backpack because I thought we might need to explore dark places." The passage led down a concrete stairway into what could only be described as an underground laboratory. Electric lights flickered on automatically as they descended, revealing a space that made everything they had found so far seem like prologue. The laboratory was larger than the cabin above, carved into the hillside and reinforced with concrete and steel. Workbenches lined the walls, equipped with precision tools and measuring instruments that looked both vintage and sophisticated. Control panels covered with switches and dials hummed with quiet power from an energy source Colton could not identify. But it was the devices that filled the space that took his breath away. Complete working models of the systems they had seen only as drawings. A machine about the size of a refrigerator that vibrated with a deep harmonic frequency. Smaller units arranged on workbenches, some partially disassembled, as if Howard had been in the middle of modifications when he was forced to stop. And in the center of the room, dominating everything else, a circular platform surrounded by rings of metal components that looked like nothing Colton had ever seen. The entire assembly was connected to monitoring equipment that showed steady readings despite having operated unattended for decades. "This is impossible," Colton whispered. "This technology should not exist." "But it does," said a voice from the shadows. Colton spun toward the sound, pulling Wyatt behind him instinctively. From a doorway at the far end of the laboratory, a figure emerged into the light. An old man with silver hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to carry the weight of decades. He moved with the careful precision of someone accustomed to working with delicate equipment, his hands steady despite his obvious age. He was perhaps 78 years old, tall and lean, wearing practical clothes suitable for life in the woods. And he was smiling at them with an expression that combined relief and satisfaction. "I have been waiting for you," the old man said. "Both of you. I have been waiting for nearly 40 years for someone like you to find this place." Colton kept Wyatt behind him, his body tense with protective instinct. "Who are you?" The old man's smile widened. "My name is Howard Callahan. I built this laboratory in 1971. I have spent the last 37 years living in these woods, watching my cabin, waiting for the right people to claim what I created. You are supposed to be dead." Howard laughed softly. "That was the idea. Dead men do not get subpoenas. Dead men do not have their work confiscated and classified. I chose to disappear so that my research could survive. And I chose to wait because I knew that someday someone would come who deserved to inherit what I built." "Why us?" Colton's voice was harsh with confusion and fear. "We are nobody. I am a mechanic with $50 to my name." "Why would you choose us, Howard?" Callahan looked at Colton with eyes that seemed to see everything past and present and future all at once. "Because I watched you sell your wife's wedding ring to buy this cabin. The last piece of the woman you loved sacrificed so your son could have a home. That is the kind of man I need. Someone who understands that some things are more important than personal comfort. Someone who will protect what matters, even when protection requires sacrifice." Howard stepped closer, his gaze moving to Wyatt. "And you, young man, you found the hidden compartments that adults walk past without noticing. You measured the shed and discovered the discrepancy. You have your mother's curiosity and your father's determination. Together, you and your father are exactly what I have been waiting for." Colton felt Wyatt's hand grip his arm, the boy's fear and excitement mingling in his touch. "What do you want from us?" Colton asked. Howard Callahan looked around his laboratory at the machines that represented a lifetime of work, at the technology that could change the world. "I want to give you everything," he said. "The technology, the research, the resources I have accumulated over 4 decades. I want to make you my heirs. But first, you need to understand what you would be inheriting and who will try to take it from you." He moved toward the central platform, his hand brushing across controls that responded to his touch with soft lights and gentle vibrations. "The man who visited your workplace 3 days ago, Raymond Schultz, he is not a historian. He is FBI, part of a unit that has been searching for me and my work since 1987. They believe my technology poses a threat to national security because it threatens to make their weapons obsolete and their energy infrastructure worthless." Colton remembered the man's careful eyes, his probing questions. "He was looking for your research. He was looking for proof that I am still alive. And now that you have found this laboratory, he will be looking even harder. The camera you disabled was one of several I used to monitor the property. He will know it went offline. He will investigate. So we are in danger." Howard nodded slowly. "Yes, you are in danger. But you are also in possession of something that could help millions of people. Technology that produces clean energy without fuel or waste. Technology that could bring power to communities that have never had electricity. Technology that governments and corporations have been trying to suppress for decades because it threatens their control." He turned to face them directly, his expression grave. "I am 78 years old. I cannot protect this work forever. I need someone to carry it forward, someone to share it with the world in a way that helps people rather than empowers those who would exploit it." His eyes found Colton's. "I believe you are that someone. The question is whether you are willing to accept the responsibility." The rain continued to fall outside, drumming against the earth above their heads. Father and son stood in an underground laboratory that should not exist, facing a man who had been dead for nearly 40 years, contemplating a decision that would change everything about their lives. And somewhere in the forest, watching and waiting, others were preparing to take what Howard Callahan had spent a lifetime protecting. The rain had stopped by the time Howard Callahan finished telling his story. 3 hours had passed in the underground laboratory hours, filled with explanations and demonstrations, and the slow unfolding of a truth that seemed impossible yet stood before them in concrete and steel and humming machinery. Colton sat on a workbench with Wyatt pressed against his side, both of them struggling to absorb the magnitude of what they had learned. The old man moved through his laboratory with the comfortable familiarity of someone who had spent decades within these walls, touching equipment and adjusting controls with hands that remembered every surface. Howard had been a young engineer in the 1960s, recruited straight from university to work on classified communications projects. His talent for unconventional thinking had made him valuable to agencies that preferred results over methodology. But his curiosity had always extended beyond what his employers wanted him to explore. Energy fascinated him. Not the crude burning of fossil fuels or the dangerous splitting of atoms, but something more fundamental. Something that existed everywhere in every cubic inch of space, waiting to be harvested by anyone who understood the principles that governed its flow. He had started his private research in 1968, working nights and weekends on theories that his supervisors would have dismissed as fantasy. By 1971, he had enough confidence in his approach to buy land and build a place where he could work without interference. The cabin had been his cover, a simple structure that looked like a weekend retreat for a bachelor who enjoyed solitude. But beneath it, he had constructed something extraordinary. A laboratory equipped for the kind of research that could not be conducted in universities or corporate facilities. A space where he could push the boundaries of known physics without anyone looking over his shoulder. The breakthrough came in 1979. Howard had built a device that produced more energy than it consumed, drawing power from what he called the zero-point field. The quantum foam that filled all space and contained virtually unlimited energy for anyone who could access it. His first working prototype had been the size of a small car. Within 2 years, he had reduced it to something that could fit on a desktop. By 1985, he had created units small enough to power individual homes indefinitely. That was when the trouble started. Someone had talked. A colleague from his government days had heard rumors and passed them to people who took such rumors seriously. Within months, Howard found himself receiving visits from men in dark suits who asked questions that felt more like demands. They wanted his research. They wanted his prototypes. They wanted him to continue working under their supervision with their security clearances for their purposes. Howard had refused. The pressure had intensified over the following 2 years. Offers of generous funding gave way to threats of legal action. When he continued to resist, the threats became more personal. His bank accounts were frozen. His property was surveilled. He received notifications that his independent research violated national security protocols that had apparently been written specifically to target his work. The final ultimatum arrived in the spring of 1987. Surrender everything or face prosecution under laws that carried decades of imprisonment. Howard had made his choice in a single night. He transferred his assets to anonymous accounts. He staged evidence of a fatal accident. He disappeared into the woods surrounding his cabin and began a new life as a ghost. For 37 years, he had lived in the hidden spaces of his own property. The underground laboratory contained everything he needed: power from his own devices, water from the spring, food from gardens hidden in the forest, and occasional carefully anonymous purchases from distant towns. He had continued his research during those decades, refining his technology and documenting everything with meticulous care. He had created caches of components and instructions throughout the property insurance against the possibility that someone might find the laboratory and destroy it. And he had watched. Every vehicle that came down Pine Ridge Road, every hiker who wandered too close, every potential buyer who showed interest in the abandoned cabin. He had been waiting for the right person, someone who would understand, someone who would continue his work, someone who deserved to inherit what he had built. Then, Colton Mercer had walked into a county courthouse with $50 and a dead wife's wedding ring, determined to buy his son a home no matter what it cost him. I knew then, Howard said, his voice soft in the humming silence of the laboratory. I knew you were the one I'd been waiting for. Colton shook his head slowly. overwhelmed by the responsibility being offered. I am a mechanic. I fix cars for a living. I do not know anything about quantum physics or energy research or whatever it is these machines do. How can I possibly continue your work?" Howard smiled. "You do not need to understand the physics. You need to understand people. You need to know who can be trusted and who will try to exploit what I have created. The technical knowledge can be learned. The moral clarity cannot." He gestured toward the central platform with its rings of gleaming components. This technology could provide clean, unlimited energy to every community on Earth. Villages that have never had electricity could have power for schools and hospitals and homes. Cities could run without burning fossil fuels or producing nuclear waste. The environmental destruction that is changing our climate could be stopped within a generation. His expression darkened, or it could be weaponized, turned into something that destroys rather than creates, locked away in classified vaults where it benefits no one. That is what the government wanted. That is what corporations still want. Control over something that should belong to everyone. He turned to face Colton directly. "I am offering you a choice. You can walk away from this. Take your cabin, raise as your son, live a simple life. I will find another way to protect my work. But if you accept what I am offering you, become responsible for something that could change the world. The question is whether you are willing to carry that weight." Colton looked down at Wyatt, who had been listening with the intense attention he gave to everything that mattered. The boy's eyes were bright, with a mixture of fear and excitement. The same combination Colton felt churning in his own chest. "What do you think?" Buddy Wyatt was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving around the laboratory, taking in the machines and the documents, and the old man who had built something extraordinary in secret. "Mom always said that good people help other people when they can." He finally replied. His voice was steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "She said that is what makes the hard stuff worth doing. If this technology can help families like us, families who do not have enough, then I think we should try." Colton felt something shift in his chest. A door opening. A path becoming clear. He looked at Howard Callahan at the hope and exhaustion and desperate faith in the old man's eyes. What exactly would we be inheriting? Howard's answer took another hour. He showed them the documentation he had prepared over decades, the legal structures that would transfer ownership of his intellectual property, the financial accounts that contained resources accumulated through careful investment of his pre-disappearance assets. $5 million, held in trusts and accounts that could not be traced to a man who had been officially dead since 1987. The money is not the point, Howard explained. It is a tool, a way to fund the development and distribution of technology that should be free for everyone. I have spent decades building this foundation so that whoever inherited my work would have the resources to share it properly. He produced a leather folder containing documents that looked both legal and permanent. Everything is prepared. The patents are filed under shell companies that you will control. The research is documented in detail that any competent engineer could follow. The prototypes are ready for replication. All that remains is for you to decide whether you want this responsibility. Colton took the folder and held it without opening it. The weight felt symbolic, the weight of a lifetime's work, the weight of a decision that could not be undone. "There are people who will try to stop us," he said. "The FBI agent. Others who want what you created." "Yes." Howard's voice was grave. "They have not stopped looking for me or my work. When you become the public face of this technology, they will focus on you. There will be pressure. There will be threats. There may be danger. Then why would anyone accept this? Because some things are worth the risk." Howard moved closer, his eyes holding Colton's with fierce intensity. "Because your son deserves to grow up in a world where clean energy is available to everyone, not just those who can afford it. Because families like yours should not have to choose between paying electric bills and buying groceries. Because what I have built can make that world possible if someone is brave enough to carry it forward." Colton thought about Grace, about the way she had believed in him, even when he did not believe in himself, about the dreams she had whispered during late nights when Wyatt was sleeping, and the future seemed full of possibilities. She would have wanted this. She would have seen the opportunity to help others and known immediately that it was worth whatever risks came with it. He opened the folder and began to read. The documents were comprehensive and carefully prepared. Legal transfers, financial authorizations, technical specifications. Everything needed to take control of Howard Callahan's life work and carry it into the future. "I need time to think," Colton said finally. "This is too big to decide in a moment." Howard nodded. "Of course. Take the documents. Read everything carefully. I will be here when you are ready to decide." They left the laboratory as evening settled over the forest. The rain had cleared and the sky was beginning to show the first stars of night. The cabin stood above them, its newly cleared walls glowing softly in the fading light. At the edge of the clearing, just before they reached the car, Colton turned back. "How will I contact you when I decide?" Howard smiled. "I will know. I will. I have been watching this property for 37 years. I will know." The drive back to town was quiet. Wyatt fell asleep against the passenger door, exhausted by hours of revelation and impossible choices. Colton drove with his hands tight on the steering wheel, and his mind spinning through implications he could barely comprehend. $5 million. Technology that could change the world. The FBI looking over his shoulder. The responsibility of protecting something that powerful men wanted to control. And underneath all of it, the simple truth that had driven every decision since Grace died. He wanted to give his son a better life. He wanted to build something that mattered. He wanted to prove that the sacrifices they had made were worth something more than mere survival. 2 weeks passed. Colton continued working at the auto shop during the day, reading Howard's documents during the night. He learned about energy harvesting and resonance frequencies and the elegant physics that made the impossible possible. He studied the legal structures that would protect the technology from seizure. He examined the financial accounts that would fund its development. Wyatt helped him understand what he was reading, the boy's quick mind, grasping concepts that challenged his father's comprehension. They worked together at the kitchen table like they had during the hard months after Grace's death. Except now they were building towards something instead of just holding on. On the third Saturday after their meeting with Howard, they returned to the cabin. Preston Hale was waiting for them. The man from the auction stood beside a black luxury car parked in their clearing. He was dressed casually this time, as if he had come for a friendly visit rather than a business proposition. But his eyes held the same calculating intensity Colton remembered from the courthouse. "Mr. Mercer." The greeting was cordial, but cold. "I was hoping we might talk." Colton positioned himself between Hale and the cabin, keeping Wyatt slightly behind him. "I do not think we have anything to discuss." "I believe we do." Hale smiled without warmth. "You see, I represent interests that have been monitoring this property for quite some time. We know about the laboratory. We know about Howard Callahan. And we know that he has been living in those woods for nearly 40 years. Colton felt his stomach drop, but kept his expression neutral. "I do not know what you are talking about. Please." Hale's voice hardened. "Do not insult my intelligence. You have been given something valuable, something that rightfully belongs to organizations with the resources to develop it properly. I am here to offer you a fair price for what you have inherited." He produced an envelope from his jacket pocket and held it out. $50,000. Cash. Enough to buy a nice house somewhere far from here. Enough to give your son the life you have been struggling to provide. All you have to do is sign over the property and walk away. Colton looked at the envelope but did not take it. "And if I refuse, then our conversations will become less pleasant." Hale's smile remained fixed, but his eyes went cold. "The people I represent do not accept refusal gracefully. They will find other ways to acquire what they want. Ways that could make your life very difficult." Wyatt stepped forward, his small frame tense with anger. "You cannot threaten my dad." Hale looked down at the boy with something like amusement. Brave child. But bravery does not pay bills or protect families from the kind of pressure that money and power can bring. Colton put his hand on Wyatt's shoulder, drawing him back. "I think you should leave now. Consider the offer carefully." Hale returned the envelope to his pocket. "You have until the end of the month to decide. After that, the offer expires and we pursue other options." He climbed into his car and drove away without looking back. Father and son stood in the clearing, watching the dust settle behind the departing vehicle. "He is scary," Wyatt said quietly. "Yes, he is. Are we going to take his money?" Colton looked down at his son, at the determination in the boy's eyes, at the courage that Grace had planted and nurtured during the 9 years she had been his mother. "What do you think we should do?" Wyatt considered the question seriously. "I think Mom would say that scary people only win if you let them scare you into giving up. I think she would say that helping other people is more important than being comfortable. I think she would say that we should tell Mr. Hale to go away and never come back." Colton knelt so he could look directly into his son's eyes. "You know that if we do this, if we accept Howard's inheritance and try to share his technology, things might get harder before they get better. People like Hale will not stop just because we refuse them." "I know." Wyatt's voice was steady. "But hard is not the same as impossible, and scared is not the same as beaten. You taught me that when Mom was sick. You taught me that we keep fighting even when fighting is hard." The words hit Colton like a physical force. His son had been watching him all along. learning from his example, growing into someone who understood that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. Okay, buddy. Colton stood and looked toward the shed that concealed the entrance to Howard's laboratory. Let us go tell him our answer. Howard Callahan was waiting at the bottom of the stairs, as if he had known they were coming. His face showed no surprise when Colton handed him the folder of documents now marked with signatures and witnessed by a notary in town who had asked no questions. "You are certain I am certain?" Howard nodded slowly. "Then we have work to do." The following weeks were a blur of activity and preparation. Howard had been planning this transition for decades, and his preparation showed in every detail. Legal documents were filed that transferred intellectual property rights to a trust controlled by Colton. Bank accounts were reorganized to provide access to the resources Howard had accumulated. Technical manuals were reviewed and updated to ensure that anyone who wanted to replicate the technology could do so without needing Howard's personal guidance. The old man worked with an energy that belied his age, driven by the knowledge that his life's work would finally reach the world he had been trying to serve for nearly 50 years. "You need to understand something," he told Colton during one of their long sessions in the laboratory. "The government and the corporations have been suppressing this technology, not because it is dangerous, but because it threatens their control. They profit from scarcity. They maintain power by controlling access to resources that should be abundant." He gestured toward the central platform with its humming rings of advanced components. "This changes everything. If energy is free and unlimited, entire industries become obsolete. Billions of dollars in infrastructure become worthless. The people who benefit from the current system will do anything to prevent that change." Colton nodded. "That is why we need to be careful about how we share it." "Exactly." Howard smiled with approval. "We do not sell the technology to the highest bidder. We do not license it to corporations that will lock it away. We give it to communities that need it most. Villages without electricity, isolated regions where conventional power is impossible to deliver. We build a network of users who benefit from the technology before the powerful interests can figure out how to stop us." They established a foundation with the careful legal structure Howard had designed. The Callahan Foundation for Sustainable Energy would hold the patents and oversee the distribution of technology to qualifying communities. Colton would serve as executive director with Howard as technical advisor. Wyatt, to his father's surprise and Howard's delight, became an integral part of the planning process. The boy's creativity and unconventional thinking led to solutions that neither adult had considered. He designed outreach materials that explained the technology in simple terms. He suggested partnerships with schools and community organizations that could help spread the word without attracting immediate corporate attention. The first production run was modest by design. 50 residential energy units, each one capable of providing unlimited clean power to a single home. Howard had trained a small team of technicians, carefully vetted individuals who understood both the technology and the need for discretion. The units would be distributed to a Native American community in remote Alaska that had never been connected to the power grid. Families that had relied on expensive diesel generators and limited solar panels would receive devices that would provide free clean energy for generations. Agent Raymond Schultz reappeared 3 weeks before the planned distribution. This time he did not pretend to be a historian. He arrived at the cabin in an official vehicle with credentials that identified him as a special agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Mr. Mercer. His tone was formal and cold. We need to talk about Howard Callahan. Colton met him on the porch, keeping the door to the cabin firmly closed. Mr. Callahan is a private citizen engaged in legal research and development. I do not believe there is anything to discuss. Schultz produced a folder from his briefcase. Howard Callahan has been evading federal authorities since 1987. His research was classified as vital to national security. His refusal to cooperate with authorized agencies constitutes a serious breach of federal law. He opened the folder and showed Colton documents that looked old and official. As the current owner of this property and the apparent beneficiary of Mr. Callahan's work, you may be considered an accessory to his crimes, unless you cooperate with our investigation. Colton studied the documents without touching them. These papers are 40 years old. The agencies that issued them no longer exist. The laws they reference have been superseded by newer statutes that protect exactly the kind of independent research Howard has been conducting. He met Schultz's eyes with steady determination. I have lawyers now. Good lawyers. The kind who understand both technology law and civil liberties. They assure me that Howard Callahan has done nothing illegal, and that any attempt to seize his work or prosecute his activities would fail spectacularly in court. Schultz's expression flickered with frustration. You do not understand the resources we can bring to bear. I understand that you have been trying to suppress beneficial technology for 4 decades and have failed. I understand that the world is changing and people are tired of being controlled by institutions that prioritize power over progress. I understand that what we are doing is legal, moral, and necessary. Colton stepped closer, his voice dropping to a fierce whisper. And I understand that threatening a single father and his 9-year-old son is not a good look for a federal agency that is supposed to serve the public interest. Schultz stared at him for a long moment. Then he returned the folder to his briefcase and turned toward his vehicle. This is not over. I am sure it is not. But we are not backing down. The agent drove away and Colton stood on the porch watching until the vehicle disappeared around the bend in Pine Ridge Road. That evening, Howard called a meeting in the laboratory. They will escalate, the old man said. Schultz was testing your resolve. Now they know you will not be intimidated easily. They will try other approaches. What kind of approaches? Wyatt asked. He had insisted on being present for all important discussions, and neither adult had found a reason to exclude him. Legal challenges, financial pressure, possibly surveillance and harassment designed to make your lives difficult enough that you reconsider your position. Howard looked at both of them with grave concern. This is your last chance to walk away. Once we begin distributing the technology, there is no going back. You will be committed to a path that may take years to complete, and will certainly involve obstacles we cannot predict. Colton looked at his son. Wyatt looked back with eyes that held no doubt. We started this together, Colton said. We finish it together. Howard nodded slowly, and something like relief washed across his weathered features. Then let us begin. 6 months later, the Callahan Foundation shipped its first 50 energy units to a remote village in Alaska. The installation took 3 days. Technicians trained by Howard worked alongside community members to connect each unit to individual homes. Children watched with wonder as lights flickered on in buildings that had never known reliable electricity. Elders wept as they realized that winter heating would no longer require expensive fuel deliveries that sometimes failed to arrive. Colton and Wyatt were present for the activation ceremony. They stood with village leaders as the first unit hummed to life, providing clean, unlimited power to a community that had been forgotten by the conventional energy infrastructure. "This changes everything," the village elder said, her voice thick with emotion. "Our children can study at night. Our elders can stay warm. Our community can grow instead of slowly disappearing." "This is just the beginning," Colton replied. "There are thousands of communities like yours around the world. We are going to reach as many as we can." The media coverage was carefully managed. Local news reported on the innovative power solution, without mentioning the technology's origins or its potential to disrupt global energy markets. Word spread through networks of activists and community organizers, rather than mainstream channels. But the powerful interests that had tried to suppress Howard's work for decades were paying attention. Preston Hale returned one final time, arriving at the cabin on an evening when spring was beginning to soften the Montana winter. $500,000, he said without preamble. "Final offer. Take it and disappear quietly. Refuse and we will bury you in litigation that lasts longer than your son's childhood." Colton stood on the porch of the cabin that had been transformed over 6 months of steady work. The structure was fully restored, now its walls clean and its windows gleaming. Smoke rose from the stone chimney that Howard had built 50 years ago. "You already tried that," he replied. "The lawsuits were dismissed. The regulatory complaints were rejected. The harassment complaints we filed against your clients are still pending." He stepped forward until he was face to face with the man who had threatened his family. "You lost. Your clients lost. And you are going to keep losing because what we are doing is right. And people know it. Every community that receives our technology becomes an advocate. Every family that escapes energy poverty becomes a voice for change. You cannot suppress something that people want this badly." Hale's face contorted with frustration. "You have no idea what you have started. I know exactly what I have started." Colton's voice was calm and certain. "I started a future where energy belongs to everyone instead of being controlled by people like your clients. That future is coming whether you like it or not." Hale left and did not return. 1 year after Colton Mercer bought a broken cabin for $50 and a wedding ring, the Callahan Foundation had provided clean energy to over 200 communities across 3 continents. The technology had spread faster than anyone predicted, passed from village to village, through networks of trust that corporate surveillance could not penetrate. Independent engineers had replicated Howard's designs using the documentation the foundation provided freely. Small manufacturing facilities had sprung up in a dozen countries, producing units that were distributed at cost to communities that needed them. The energy giants had tried everything to stop the spread. Lawsuits, lobbying, propaganda campaigns claiming the technology was dangerous or unreliable, but the evidence spoke louder than their denials. Families that had lived in darkness for generations now had light. Schools that had closed during winter months now stayed open year-round. Hospitals that had been unable to refrigerate vaccines now saved lives that would have been lost. The world was changing one community at a time. On a warm evening in October, exactly 1 year after the auction that had started everything, Colton sat on the porch of his cabin, watching the sun set behind the mountains. Wyatt was inside working on homework with Howard, their voices drifting through the open window as they debated some technical problem that had caught the boys' interest. The cabin was home now in every sense of the word, restored and expanded and filled with the life that Grace had always dreamed of creating for their family. Colton reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He had redeemed Grace's wedding ring months ago, using money from the foundation that Howard had insisted belonged to him. The ring sat in its box now not as a relic of the past, but as a reminder of everything it had purchased. A home, a purpose, a future. He opened the box and something fluttered out. A piece of paper so small and thin that he had never noticed it tucked into the velvet lining. His hands trembled as he unfolded the note, recognizing Grace's handwriting before his eyes could focus on the words. Colton, if you are reading this, it means you sold the ring. I know that was not easy, and I know you only did it when there was no other choice. Do not be sad, my love. The ring was never what mattered. What mattered was you. What mattered was Wyatt. What mattered was the family we built together, which does not end just because I am not there anymore. I always believed you would find your way. I always knew that when things got hard enough, you would discover strength you did not know you had. That strength was never about me. It was always inside you, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Take care of our son. Build something beautiful with your life. And know that wherever you go, whatever you become, I am proud of you. I have always been proud of you. All my love forever, Grace. Colton read the words 3 times before his vision blurred too much to continue. She had known. Somehow, during those final months, when the cancer was taking everything she had found, a moment to write this note and hide it where he would only find it if he was desperate enough to sell her ring. She had been preparing him for this, giving him permission to let go of the past and build something new. Dad. Wyatt stood in the doorway, concern on his young face. Are you okay? Colton wiped his eyes and beckoned his son forward. I found something. Something your mother left for us. He handed Wyatt the note and watched the boy read it slowly, his lips moving with each word. She knew Wyatt whispered. She knew we would be okay. She always knew. Colton pulled his son into an embrace that held all the grief and joy and gratitude he could not put into words. She always believed in us, even when we did not believe in ourselves. They stood together on the porch of their cabin as the last light faded from the sky, father and son, bound by love that death could not diminish and hope that no obstacle could destroy. Behind them, the cabin that had started as a desperate gamble glowed with warm light from windows that looked out on a world being transformed one community at a time. Above them, the first stars of evening emerged like promises being kept. And in Colton's pocket, next to his heart, Grace's ring waited to be passed down to a son who would carry her legacy forward into a future she had always known they would build. The broken place they had found had become something beautiful. The $50 gamble had become something priceless, and the family that had lost so much had discovered that love given freely and without expectation always finds its way home.